and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation with a changemaker working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable carbon-neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Welcome back. This is season 3. We're just starting off. I hope that you're going to enjoy what we've got coming. A lot of fascinating conversations upcoming. Today, we're going to talk about equity. Equity is essential to sustainability. 64 low-income countries, which have produced the least greenhouse gas emissions, face significant economic and environmental challenges that may prevent them from decarbonizing their economies. And yet, even if they don't decarbonize, these nations will produce only 1% of global emissions by 2035. Without assistance, these countries are going to fall further behind the nations that have benefited the most during the industrial era. Our guest today is Arthur Baker of the Development Innovation Lab at University of Chicago. He's the co-author with Vijaya Ramachandran of Let Them Eat Carbon, a Center for Global Development policy paper that suggests it is not just unjust, but inefficient to make the poorest countries carry the climate burden. The Paris Accords include a commitment by wealthy nations to contribute $100 billion a year to help low-income countries transition to low or no carbon infrastructures. But the rich nations have not kept their promises. They've delivered only $79 billion in funding a year as of 2019, so we're falling short. You can learn more about the University of Chicago's Development Innovation Lab at bfi.uchicago.edu. Then search for Development Innovation Lab. And you can learn more about the Center for Global Development at www.cgdev.org. Welcome to the show, Arthur. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing well. Thanks. How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you for asking. Now, I want to, you did a great job in summarizing a lot of the issues around the relationship between the low-income world and the rest of the world. But I want to ask just generally, how much investment is needed overall to improve low-income countries' energy and transportation infrastructures to the level where they can begin to innovate themselves, not just rely on the rest of the world to do it, but to begin to innovate themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. One thing I'd note is that low and middle income countries are innovating. I think a lot of the kind of frontier technological innovation comes from richer countries, but it does take a lot of ingenuity to change things and adapt things for local contexts. And, so there's things like drought-resistant seeds that are being developed in low and middle income countries, lots of kind of miniature solar grids and things. That kind of policy innovation is definitely already happening. But of course, those countries being richer does help that innovation happen. It's a sliding scale. I don't think there's a exact point. In terms of exactly how much investment is needed, it's really difficult to give an exact number. And again, it's a sliding scale. So, I think many of your listeners will have seen the things that are happening in Pakistan right now. And Pakistan is probably better able to deal with these kind of catastrophes than some countries which are poorer than Pakistan, some really low-income countries. But of course, when we've seen these kind of, when we've seen floods in richer countries, in high-income countries, there's even less fallout. So how much outside investment is needed? It's difficult to say, but I think the thing that we need to focus on is that lower income countries need to get up to the living standards that we see in high income countries, and that needs to happen faster than it's happened historically.
Well, and this is the other big question I want to start with is, why is poverty reduction an essential first step? We've seen, for instance, in birth rates that once you raise the standard of living, birth rates decline, and of course that's a great outcome. But what's the essential reason to reduce poverty first and then move into a more sustainable society?
Yeah, I think there's 3 reasons why poverty should be the first step. So I think the first reason that poverty should be the first step is there's a moral imperative to reduce poverty. People shouldn't be dying because they don't have enough resources. The second is that emissions in low-income countries are just very, very low. So I think sometimes people worry that if we address poverty first, if we let people in poorer countries increase their incomes, then suddenly emissions from those countries will become really, really high, and that will be a problem for climate change. And thinking about the poorest countries, that's really not true. Those countries could really grow quite a lot without thinking about emissions reductions, and it would make a negligible impact on climate change just because the emissions in those countries are really so low. And the third is that we really need to increase incomes and reduce poverty in order to reduce the worst effects of climate change. So to avoid the worst effects of climate change, we really need to do two things. We need to reduce emissions, and that you hear a lot about, but we also need to allow people to increase their incomes. And as I said before, the reason that is because when you get these extreme weather events, people will need to adapt to that. People will need to move. People will need to, do various things that will prevent them from, being forced into destitution or being killed. And people are much more able to do that if they have higher incomes.
So for a lot of folks listening, that may be a little counterintuitive. There's this general assumption that when your standard of living rises, your emissions rise. Can you dig into a little bit why a low-income country that's already sustaining itself on substantially lower emissions than the United States, and the United States is only 13th in the world, and yet we use so much more than everybody else because of how much we spend. Tell us how that works. How can the rich world's emissions decline while simultaneously low-income countries become wealthier and still stay below 1% of the total emissions globally?
So I think the thing to consider here is just how much more the US and other rich countries emit than poorer countries. So the US emits about 14 tons of CO2 per year per person. And for a low-income country, that's 0.3 tons. So it's just a huge, huge gap. And so if, we did some calculations where we basically said, what if rich countries emissions reduced towards net zero in 2050, which we all know we need to achieve, and what if poor countries grew their economies really, quite rapidly by 5%, 6%, 8%, if we did different scenarios, without greening their economies, without changing the carbon intensity of growth. And we found that those low-income countries would still be producing below 1% of global emissions. And the reason for that is just because they start from such a low base.
So what countries are we talking about? For instance, India, which is the third largest emitter, has also asked for $1 trillion in assistance to meet its climate goal, which is net zero emissions by 2070. What geographies are we talking about, and where do we need to think about concentrating our efforts?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think often people talk about developing countries as a kind of big homogenous blob, and that gets really confusing because it includes China and India. It also includes, Liberia and Sierra Leone, and they're kind of very, very different places. So when I was talking about low-income countries there, I was talking about, the actual low-income countries. So that's the poorest countries in the world. There's only, 20 odd of them. There's about a tenth of the world population live there, and they emit very, very little. And then there's lower middle income countries, and that includes India. And even within lower middle income countries, there's a really, really big gap. So there's, Nigeria and Ghana, and they're still producing well under 1 ton of CO2 per person. Same with Pakistan. And then India is producing more. I think it's 3 or 4 tons. Even within India, and so those poorest countries, those low-income countries, and some lower middle-income countries, I did another piece of work where I looked at the 64 poorest countries in the world, and basically those 64 poorest countries, their emissions are negligibly small, even if they grow. India is a bit of a different case, partly just because it's so big. Per person, its emissions are still tiny compared to the US, but there's a lot of people there. And there's a lot of diversity within India. So you do have people who don't have access to electricity, who don't have access to enough fertilizer, etc. And those people will need to increase their energy usage. But you also have coal mines and wealthier people. And so India kind of has both within it.
Well, and what would you say people are using or emitting CO2 doing? Is it cooking, heating, cooling? And obviously, particularly with regard to cooling, as the climate warms, do we expect them to generate a lot more CO2 from air conditioning?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the people in the really poorest countries, the thing that they're doing mostly is cooking. And then there'll also be a lot of emissions from agriculture. Agriculture, produces emissions. I think cooling is going to be increasingly important for people in South Asia and in Africa. But South Asia is going to get very, very hot with climate change, and people will want to use cooling technologies. I think it's vital that we figure out ways to have cheaper, more efficient, greener cooling technologies, both because that's going to reduce emissions from cooling, and because I think it's really important from a humanitarian perspective. If you've got temperatures well above 100 degrees, people will need to cool.
One would hope so. Otherwise, we're going to see a lot of deaths. Let's talk about wealthier countries. Are they keeping their commitments? There was an additional round of funding committed at COP26 in Glasgow by the United States and United Kingdom, for instance. Are we putting enough into the investment in low-income countries' greening of their economies?
Yeah, sadly, no. So there was this commitment to have by 2020 $100 billion of new and additional climate finance. But that was made in 2009. By 2018, it was there was 78 billion that had been badged as climate finance. But the devil is in the detail there, and the issue is that what they said was it should be new and additional. So basically, that means we shouldn't just be cutting aid spending for the poorest in order to pay for climate finance. We should be making new money available. And so some of my former colleagues at the Centre for Global Development looked at this, and they found that about half of that was actually not new and additional. It was just previous development finance that had been displaced or rebadged. And so we're quite a long way away from that. And I'd add, you mentioned India's request for $1 trillion by 2030. The reason that that's much higher is because what they're asking for, in addition, is compensation for loss and damage. So all this climate finance that people often talk about is about mitigation, reducing emissions, and adaptation, helping people adapt to climate change. But what lots of low-income countries want, in addition, is compensation for the loss and damage caused by climate change. So, Pakistan, a third of the country is underwater, 30 million people displaced. Whose job is it to pay for the cleanup there? I think it's difficult to say, well, it's all Pakistan's job.
Yeah, there's a tendency to say, hey, that's inside your borders, deal with it. But the fact is, the climate is global, and the global climate was heated primarily by the wealthier nations. So, but do you see that as a potential point of contention that could prevent the kind of cooperation that we need to, or the dialogue about cooperation that we need to make progress?
Yeah, I hope not. I would say that, India's made a big request there. And we say India has made, really, it's the Indian government, the Indian Prime Minister. So maybe not everyone in India agrees, but there's a big request made there. I think it's a negotiating position. I think it's reasonable to start out with a tough negotiating position. And I hope that so long as everybody's willing to get around the table and discuss this, that we should be able to continue with these negotiations.
Well, it seems like one of the things that we can also calculate is the potential savings by offsetting future damage. Is that something that we can factor into these negotiations? Can we say to India, for instance, we're going to reduce the impact of climate change by $500 billion. Therefore, we are helping you. And would that be the basis for progress, or would they just say, you're just trying to displace one cost with another?
No, I think absolutely. I'm not sure how, I don't know about the specific quantification, but I think if rich countries like the US, like Europe, were to really show that we're doing our bit to reduce emissions, I think that will help. That will help, persuade other countries that they should do their bit as well. I think from the perspective of India or Nigeria, when Europe says, you shouldn't use your gas, you shouldn't emit, at the same time that Europe and the US are kind of scrambling to expand their own gas supplies. I think it's a difficult sell, but I think absolutely if we say we're making these efforts, and that will reduce the cost for you as well. That should help.
So, in a nutshell, and I know this is a huge question with a lot of different answers, but what are the keys to lifting low-income countries into a sustainable prosperity? Besides technology, what do they need?
So I think one thing technology is clearly important. But you've already said that. I think one thing they need is concessional finance, and a lot of concessional finance. So one thing they need is a huge amount of infrastructure. These countries need to build roads, they need to build, bridges, they need to build ports, they need to build all of this infrastructure that is going to enable people to be lifted out of poverty. And that is going to require a lot of concessional funding. The US, the UK, rich countries in general also borrow to finance projects like this, but we're able to borrow at very low rates, 1 or 2%. Right. Whereas developing countries often pay maybe 10%, maybe 20% interest, which is unaffordable when they're borrowing on private markets. So the World Bank is there to kind of give these countries concessional financing that will enable them to make these important investments. And I think rich countries need to put a lot more money into the World Bank and into other multinationals, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, that will enable this kind of investment. At the moment, I'm worried that what's happening is rich countries are shareholders are pressuring the World Bank and these other organizations to move all of their funding into climate mitigation. And also, and the problem with that is, as discussed, climate mitigation funding is not going to be that effective in the poorest countries because there's not that many emissions to reduce. And I think that these countries need to, the shareholders of the World Bank, which is basically rich countries like the US and the UK, need to allow some financing for fossil fuels in the poorest countries, because there's some things, as we know, that we're not able to do with renewables yet. So people need to be able to get gas cookers to reduce deaths from indoor pollution. People need to be able to produce fertilizers. We need to be able to build roads, factories, etc. And at the moment, the World Bank is really being pressured to not build any fossil fuel infrastructure at all in the poorest countries, and that will really constrain development.
What's the role of education in all of this? Because it seems like one of the things that we tend to do is this is the traditional wealthy countries reach out and help the poor countries approach. We'll help you, but we won't teach you how to fish. What's the role of education in solving these problems within all these countries?
Yeah, I think education is incredibly important. Education is important because it increases incomes. And I think education is one area where it's possible to make a lot of progress. So, there are some proven interventions in education that can really improve learning outcomes. So one area is teaching at the right level. I don't know if your listeners will have heard of this, possibly they will, but a lot of poorer countries have this problem where kids are falling behind the curriculum, maybe because they're learning in their second or third language, maybe because they have missed school because of health issues or because of poverty. And once you've fallen behind, it's really difficult to catch up. And so interventions which help to teach at the right level, so kids can really follow the classes, can have huge impacts, and also can be quite cheap because you're not putting in a load more resources, you're just kind of refocusing the curriculum at people. And sometimes that means changing curriculum, sometimes it means kind of after school clubs and remedial education. There are other approaches, structured pedagogy, various approaches. I think education is really important.
It's interesting to think about the impact of COVID on education in the rich world right now, because, for instance, so many kids in the United States and Europe have missed a couple of years of school for all intents and purposes. To some extent, we now have a shared problem of entire generations being behind in terms of education. Maybe that's the galvanizing point.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, it's completely shared. It's, this is something that's happened in poorer countries as well. Yeah. And it's a real problem. One hopeful note, I saw some data from Sierra Leone recently, where just before COVID, they made secondary education free and universal. And education and schools enrollment increased by half between 2018 and 2021. And considering there's COVID in the middle, that's a really impressive feature. So this stuff really is possible.
Yeah, Arthur, this is fascinating. I want to take a quick break to have a few commercials, pay for the show. We'll be right back. We're back to continue our conversation with Arthur Baker of the Development Innovation Lab at the University of Chicago and co-author of the Center for Global Development's policy paper, Let Them Eat Carbon. So, Arthur, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about as I read the paper is how do we break the idea, and why do we need to break the idea of treating the low income world as just of a big single piece, like it's all one big problem? Why would making that change make this a more efficient investment?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said before, to avoid the worst effects of climate change, we need to both reduce emissions and we need to reduce poverty. And I think generally it makes sense to first reduce emissions in the places that have high emissions, and it makes sense to reduce poverty in the places that have high poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily, those are maybe luckily is the wrong word, but those are completely different places. So the poorest countries have, incredibly low emissions, and the richest countries have much, much higher emissions. Another way you could think about this is if you think about individual things that we need to decarbonize, what do you think about first? You think about power plants, coal mines, you think about, things like that. And those are really concentrated in richer countries. What are the last things you might do? Well, things that are really hard to decarbonize. So production of, cement and concrete, maybe cooking fuels. And those are kind of some of the only things, agriculture. These are some of the only things that are being done in the low income countries.
Now, the other big challenge here is that there are a lot of these countries that are sitting on a lot of natural gas and other fossil fuel reserves that could potentially finance their growth.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, Nigeria has about 200 trillion cubic feet of natural gas reserves. They've been asked to leave that in the ground. Foregoing that revenue obviously has a lot of consequences for them. Do we need a global carbon credit system in order to begin to finance those nations' progress without those nations having to contribute to the carbon load in the environment?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me break that into two pieces. The first,
Sure.
I think, is there's a lot of natural gas in Africa. And I think people really worry about what happens if Africa uses that natural gas. And I don't think people should worry. So I said some statistics before about what would happen if these countries grew their economies. Todd Moss, who's another researcher, looked at what would happen if Africa tripled its energy using only natural gas. And the answer was very little. Similarly, they find less than a 1% increase in global emissions. Again, because energy usage in Africa is really quite low. So, Nigeria is sitting on that gas. I would be in favor of Nigeria using that gas to make its people richer.
But there's the opportunity to sell that gas, for instance, to Europe, which has a big natural gas problem right now, which would be much worse, would it not?
Absolutely, that's right. I think, and so should we be paying Nigeria to keep the gas in the ground if we want them to? I think the answer is yes. And it's not just gas. On a similar note, it's really important that the DRC doesn't do much deforestation in the Congo Basin.
Right.
Same with Brazil and the Amazon. But they could make a lot of money doing that. So, if we want them to leave it, I think we should pay for it. And there's some really promising interventions that involve paying people not to cut down trees. I think we could do similar things for gas. One piece of research that I worked on is called Sky Shares. And basically it said, we have this shared resource, which is the amount of carbon we can still emit while staying within safe limits. So, we need to get to net zero by 2050. There's a certain amount of carbon that we can emit in that time while still staying within 1.5 degrees C. Well, who gets to emit that carbon? Who owns the sky?
Right.
I think the only really fair way to think about it would be to say, we all do equally. So with this Sky Shares approach, we basically imagined a kind of cap and trade scheme. I should say that I didn't develop this. It was Alice Lepicia and Owen Barder. I kind of updated it. But basically what we said was, well, what happened? How should the sky be allocated? How should the right to emit be allocated? So we imagined a trading scheme where each country had their own portion that they were allowed to emit. How should that be divided up between countries? Well, let's say that at the beginning, the per capita emissions remain, the same as current per capita emissions, but rich countries should decline sharply while poor countries are allowed to increase their emissions a little bit, so that the per capita emissions converge before they all fall to zero. And we imagined a scheme where countries would be able to, if they were emitting more than their fair share, would be able to buy permits to emit from other countries who are emitting less than their fair share. And basically, what that would mean is big transfers from rich countries to poor countries. So the US, it would cost something like 1 or 2% of US GDP. And countries like Ethiopia would get 40% of their GDP back in climate payments. This is an ambitious scheme. I'm not expecting this to happen, but I think that shows, from a perspective of justice, that shows some of, one way to imagine this. Another is, as you said, to literally say to countries that have a lot of fossil fuels, we will pay you to leave these in the ground.
Mm-hmm. So what are the global institutions that our listeners should be following in order to understand this debate as it evolves?
Yeah, so the World Bank is one really important institution. The World Bank is the multilateral agency that is responsible for poverty reduction. And it's also, I think, the largest agency for climate finance. There's also the Green Climate Fund. And the Green Climate Fund pays for mitigation and adaptation projects in developing countries. And then there's also regional development banks, things like the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank. But I would also look, if people are thinking about climate change, the most important institutions are the ones within rich countries. The most important institutions are the ones that affect how much we emit in the UK and the US and others, because that's where the real action is for emissions.
Well, it also seems like the other facet of this is rethinking the way that we're currently capitalizing fossil fuels investments. Could we shift fossil fuel project financing to renewable energy programs for low-income nations in order to drive some of this transition?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would say two things. I think one is that we should definitely finance renewable energy projects in low-income countries and middle-income countries as well, and that's already happening. So I think that the World Bank, I think more than 90% of its energy projects were renewables. And lots of developing countries are really planning a renewable focused future. So Kenya, Zambia, Ethiopia already generating more than 50% of their power from renewables, compared to 20% in the US. And in the future, they're really planning to double down on renewable energy. However, you can't get that to 100% just yet. We still need some fossil fuel financing, especially natural gas financing in developing countries, because like I said, we've got a lot of infrastructure to build. We still need to produce fertilizer, and that requires gas. We need to get people away from cooking with very dirty fuels, which causes terrible health problems and terrible problems for climate, and towards using gas cookers, and that requires, again, gas fossil fuels. It's not really realistic yet to imagine that everybody in the poorest countries is going to have an induction stove. So we definitely need to have financing for renewables, but I don't think bearing down on that last little bit of financing for gas in developing countries is the way to do that. I think we need to provide more financing overall.
So what if we flip the script and think about not trying to finance more renewable energy in these low-income countries, but more renewable energy in the United States and Europe, which are the leading emitters, in order to offset and pay for low-income countries not to use their fossil fuels? Can we, even though we aren't directly using those fossil fuels today, could we set up a scheme where our reductions gave them credit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is kind of the fundamental point, because climate change is a pure global public good. It doesn't matter really where emissions happen. Whatever country the carbon is emitted, it doesn't matter. And so I think developing countries are going to need to increase emissions a little bit, and to offset that, to keep us within safe limits, rich countries will have to reduce our emissions more quickly, and that will cost some money. But I think most people would be willing to do that.
So you've mentioned what you describe as real progress. What are some of the actual signals that folks should point at and say, look, there's an example of success? Can you give a few of those examples?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think recently there was South Africa is the largest emitter within sub-Saharan Africa. because basically South Africa uses coal, and not many other places within sub-Saharan Africa use coal, or it's kind of negligible outside South Africa. And there was recently a deal to reduce coal usage in South Africa, and that involved a big lump of financing from richer countries. And I think that is that's an example of success. That's us moving places. I think you can point to some developing countries which are just using huge, like I said, Kenya, Ethiopia, Zambia are using huge amounts of renewables and really installing a lot of renewable energy, and I think that is very, very promising. To recognize, I've criticized the US a lot so far, but through recently a piece of legislation passed that is going to reduce emissions in the US, and I think that's really good as well. One thing we haven't talked about so far is carbon capture. So this is an area where you need innovation. This is an area where you need technology, and it does seem like it should be possible, or at least we hope it's possible, to capture carbon from the air. So there's a Frontier Climate is a new initiative, which is basically, it's called an advanced market commitment, which is basically, instead of trying to buy carbon capture now, it's a way of spending money to incentivize a new technology to be developed. It's a 1.2 billion commitment, I think, at the moment, and I think that's really, really, really very promising.
So financing future carbon sequestration, capture and sequestration is another way that we can think about getting to where we want to be, but not necessarily doing it today. And that long view, it seems to me, is really critical to how we get out of this pickle.
Yeah, absolutely. And something we haven't touched on again, but I think is going to be a big part of the solution, is nuclear. India has nuclear power. There's some nuclear power in Europe. At the moment, multilateral institutions won't really finance nuclear power in developing countries because some shareholders are very against it for kind of ideological reasons. But I think nuclear is a substitute for coal and oil in a way that for some of those uses that renewables are not yet. Gas still is, but I think nuclear is going to be a part of the solution.
Yeah, that's an uncomfortable topic for a lot of people, but I tend to agree that what we need are alternative generation, and hopefully fusion comes online sometime in the next decade too, which would be a transformative change. What programs out there should our listeners be looking for? Are there any things that they can do today directly, whether it's urging their representatives to support a program or to make contributions to make the carbon transition happen faster in lower income countries?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I would say certainly urge your representatives to reduce emissions in rich countries. I think that's incredibly important. I would really, I've made this argument a couple of times, but I think it's, looking at what's happening in Pakistan, I think it's really urgent that we help people escape poverty, so that, we know that these climate events are coming. And I'm terrified that people are going to be living on $1 a day and have no resilience when they do happen. So I would look at ways, and I'm focusing on poverty here because I'm not sure what you can do with your small-ish personal donations to reduce emissions. But what you can do is reduce poverty. You can give to Give Directly, which is a charity which distributes money directly to the poorest people in the world. And there's a huge amount of really rigorous evidence that suggests that those people use the money in a very smart, in a very productive way, and that it reduces poverty. You can give to, charities addressing death from malaria. You can give to charities improving education, improving health. I would look at GiveWell, which is a charity evaluator, which does incredibly rigorous research, so you can really know that what you're donating will reduce poverty. And hopefully, if enough of us do that, and we write to our representatives, hopefully we'll both be able to reduce the emissions. And when these things do happen, people will be a bit more prepared.
Well, it's certainly the case that a silver bullet isn't the answer. It's a lot of different efforts that we need to make. And it's been fascinating to talk with you about all those. How can listeners follow along with what you're doing? Are you working on any new research right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of this research I've talked about so far most of it was from my previous job at the Center for Global Development. Right now I work at the Development Innovation Lab at the University of Chicago. We develop innovations to benefit people in low and middle income countries. So one thing we've been looking at recently is how to get more water treatment to people, which is particularly important now that the water table is lowering, now that climate change is causing droughts. How do we get safe water to people? We recently conducted a meta-analysis which suggests that distributing water treatment can reduce child mortality from all causes by around a quarter, which is incredibly huge. So you can Google the Development Innovation Lab. It's worth looking at Evidence Action, which is another charity you could donate to. They're getting water treatment to people. They recently just got a large grant to get water treatment to 9 million more people in East Africa. And hopefully that's going to continue to expand.
Well, Arthur, thank you very much for taking time to talk with us today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much.
We have been talking with Arthur Baker of the Development Innovation Lab at the University of Chicago. He's the co-author with Vijaya Ramachandran of Let Them Eat Carbon, a Center for Global Development policy paper. Well, folks, once again, we've heard that climate change involves a global responsibility for sustaining the environment, combined with the opportunity to raise people's standard of living. And when we do that, we reduce population growth, as well as increase the utilization of renewable energy and innovation in food production, waste and water management, and many other things. So take a few minutes to check out the sites that Arthur mentioned. GiveWell, that's at givewell.org, and Evidence Action, which is at evidenceaction.org. They research charitable donations that make the biggest impact. And take a few minutes to change your habits. Do one thing today to reduce your dependence on fossil fuels, for instance, or single-use plastic. We can make a difference. I also hope you'll take a few minutes to share this podcast or one of the 230 others that we've already done with your friends, family, and people you work with, because they often have a lot of impact on the world around you. These ideas can catalyze action at home and around the world, but we need to get them out there to start the momentum. As I mentioned, we're starting season 3 of Sustainability in Your Ear this month. Stay tuned for a lot of new guests and some return guests who will catch us up on their work. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Audible, and Spotify, just to name a few great places to discover new podcasts. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we're going to be back soon with another innovator interview. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.